and thanks for joining me. My presentation is entitled Creating a New Culture, and today I'll be exploring transition as a cultural revitalization movement. Transition is an international movement that promotes local resilience in anticipation of climate change and fossil fuel scarcity. Although it addresses the quintessential 21st century environmental issues of climate change, resource depletion, and transitioning away from fossil fuel dependency, it is distinguished from other environmental movements by its explicit call to change and generate culture. My ethnographic research among transition participants in Central Ohio and literature produced by and about transition initiatives around the world affirm that transition seeks a cultural shift that goes far beyond conserving resources and protecting regions. As Emily Polk discovered during her work with Transition Amherst in Massachusetts, it is about moving from one ideology to another. As I contemplated this fundamental feature of the movement that had attracted me as both a hopeful participant and a scholarly observer, I was struck by the realization that Anthony F.C. Wallace, a mid-20th century anthropologist renowned for his theory of cultural revitalization, had long ago found words to describe what I was witnessing: a deliberate, organized, conscious effort by members of a society to construct a more satisfying culture. Transition originated in 2006 when permaculture students in Totnes, England began exploring the possibility of a proactive descent from fossil fuel dependency. From there, the idea spread rapidly. Today, transition is a loosely integrated international movement with over 1,000 official registered groups and countless unofficial ones in 43 countries around the world. Transition is not a protest movement in any conventional sense. Instead, it empowers people to determine their community's destiny through practical here and now action. It encourages personal and pragmatic experimentation with better ways to live. Transition thus exemplifies an environmentalism of everyday life that aims to replace unsuitable practices and circulations of power with more sustainable ones. My research on the transition movement began in the spring of 2018 with participatory research in my own town, a 40,000 resident suburb of Columbus, Ohio. From the perspective of a native anthropologist, I watched as a small transition group came together, hosted events, and planned for its future. My research thus embodies a critically engaged approach that seeks to unite scholarship and emplaced activism in one dynamic undertaking. To date, I have conducted over 140 hours of participant observation and interviewed key local transition participants. A comprehensive literature and media review of material published by and about the transition movement complemented my primary data collection. On the surface, the transition movement seems to have little in common with the historical cases of rapid religious conversion among small-scale non-Western societies documented by Wallace and his colleagues. But the original revitalization framework describes transition surprisingly well, with participants perceiving their culture as an increasingly unsatisfactory system and attempting to relieve anxiety by transforming their images of self, society, and culture, as well as by impelling changes in the real system that surrounds them. Throughout my career, I've wondered why some people take environmental action while seemingly similar others do not. From what I've seen, most attempts to explain individual environmentally protective action and collective environmental movement formation have tended to respectively emphasize personal values and pre-existing community conditions and constraints. While a handful of studies have examined how household and societal factors influence individual behavior, inadequate attention has been paid to environmental movements' social causes and consequences. How do environmental movements meet interpersonal needs? And how do social considerations increase participation and promote long-term movement success? I contend that refocusing the revitalization framework on a contemporary movement that is unfolding across a global network in response to the unique problems and prospects of the Anthropocene era can illuminate imperative yet often neglected social dimensions of environmental movements. My study of the transition movement reveals that participation is often as much about personal well-being and community cohesion as it is about expressing environmental values and beliefs. Transition, we'll soon see, is a revitalization movement that offers a hopeful remedy for Anthropocene angst, reclaims the possibility of a positive future, creates safe space for political resistance, and engenders a multi-scalar sense of community. Ultimately, I argue, taking the social dimensions of environmental movements seriously means embracing environmental and interpersonal action as both complementary and inextricably intertwined. More pragmatically, exploring environmental movements' social aspects sheds new light on why individuals choose to participate, or not, in the campaigns that are needed to bring about broad behavioral changes and evade catastrophic climate change and socioecological collapse. We live in a time of crisis. The climate is changing rapidly, bringing rising sea levels and extreme weather. The sixth great extinction is underway, and we are approaching or have already surpassed countless critical ecological thresholds. The term Anthropocene underscores humanity's enormous impacts on global climate, landforms, and ecosystems. Literally, a new geological epoch, but figuratively an indictment and a warning. The anachronistic notion that economic growth can be infinitely perpetuated has been shattered by the conjoined global crises of climate, ecosystems, and resources. Even while large segments of society remain ensconced in active social distortion campaigns, transition participants realize that not only have we been living beyond our means for hundreds of years, but also that our mistakes are quickly catching up with us. The personal ramifications of our changing environments and expectations are profound. We grieve when familiar landscapes are destroyed by extraction, contamination, or commercial development, and increasingly we find ourselves grieving for lost futures, for the suffering our children will endure, for the shattered world our successors will inherit, for a civilization at its end. The transition movement offers tools for responding to these new forms of grief and addresses the profound angst evoked by the realization that Western industrial culture is no longer tenable. Even as transitioners endeavor to protect and heal the environment, they stand among the growing number of environmentalists who acknowledge climate change and its associated catastrophes as inevitable. This recognition is accompanied by a sense of loss that must somehow be processed. While the anticipation of inevitable but indeterminate socioecological transformations may initially trigger apprehension and fear, transition views the ongoing systemic crisis as an opportunity for positive growth. Rather than surrender to unproductive anxiety and pessimism, participants see the decline of the current system not as a cause of despair, but as a transformational opportunity, a prospective change for the better that should be embraced rather than feared. Alleviating the profound angst associated with Anthropocene life, the movement's positive vision of the future is one of its major social accomplishments. As Wallace asserted, cultural revitalization requires a systemic cultural understanding. Unlike more gradual and conventional processes of cultural change, deliberate intent by members sets revitalization movements apart. While the interdisciplinary study of socioecological systems did not cohere until the late 20th century, early conceptualizations of multifaceted systems and adaptive agency are evident in Wallace's work. Within contemporary SES studies, cultural and political action are regarded as components of complex and conjoined systems that are simultaneously social and natural. Significantly, humans emerge in this view as reflexive and creative agents of deliberate change who are uniquely capable of anticipatory action. Realizing that humans are not necessarily doomed to remain destructive antagonists in the Earth's story, but could instead be protagonists who influence the world in positive ways, transitioners work proactively to design their community's destiny. In so doing, they reclaim a powerful sense of control over the future. Socioecological system scholars have identified revitalization as a powerful adaptive force. Social movements are both essential to society's survival and significant shapers of the socioecological worlds humans help to create. While observers often equate adaptation to improved infrastructure or technological fixes, Thornton and Manosfi argue history shows that in many instances, adaptation was achieved only through radical reorganization or innovation in the face of destabilizing environmental stress. Seen in this light, transition and other contemporary cultural revitalization movements constitute reflexive responses to the broad socioecological systemic transformations of the Anthropocene era. Recognizing that we have the power to shape our system is critical to the applied optimism transition promotes. Participants know the world is vast and complex. They know they are up against powerful forces and entities whose ideal futures look very different from the ones they themselves envision. Yet far from inducing an overwhelmed paralysis, this knowledge emboldens them to take action at small local levels where their impact can be readily regarded. Facing a world of tomorrow that is capricious, contingent, and confusing, today's citizens frequently have trouble planning for, acting upon, and designing their own futures. Transition responds by forming a new relationship with the future, one that is more promising and more empowering. Rejecting dominant cultural visions that vacillate between unrealistic techno-optimism and dystopian horror, transition participants imagine a revitalized future of fulfilling self-sufficiency. 21st century reassessments of the cultural revitalization model place the political connotations Wallace hinted at near the center of their analysis. It is now clear that not only are cultural revitalization movements defined in the dialogic space between cultures, but revitalization is itself an act of resistance. All revitalization movements are oppositional, confirms Maria Lepowski, arising among cultural minorities and catalyzed by the moral and political crises that accompany unequal encounters. Stated otherwise, revitalization movements are strategies to gain power relative to a dominant and encompassing society. Most cultural revitalization case studies have focused on recently colonized indigenous peoples in North America and the Pacific Islands. In these instances, one clearly defined cultural group imposed upon another. The more powerful group was a catalyst for revitalization, while the subordinated group experienced increased stress, cultural distortion, and revitalization as a consequence. In contrast, transition and other Western industrial revitalization movements are inspired by internal disagreements within a single, complex society regarding fundamental values, assumptions about the future, and how to respond to socioecological crises. Participants in these movements often self-identify as members of a minority counterculture, distinguished from the dominant mainstream only by subtle subcultural differences. They deploy revitalization as a conscious form of cultural critique. Recognizing the enormity of today's socioecological challenges, transitioners perceive a need for swift and substantive action. Yet they also acknowledge that neither established governmental structures nor neoliberal market-based solutions have the interest or ability required to enact truly sustainable solutions. This insight invites exciting possibilities for local action. Rather than political action targeting the state and its subsidiaries, transition participants advocate sub-political or micro-political action, in which individual choice is repositioned as a focus of one's arguments and creative resistance is expressed through one's daily activities. Rather than the flamboyant activism of public protest, transition participants engage in an everyday activism with the aim of inspiring others to alter their behaviors and beliefs. By embodying new forms of power and being part of more sustainable flows of food, energy, and other everyday needs, movements like transition simultaneously express forms of resistance and empowerment. In Ohio and elsewhere, transition is a way to resist mainstream consumer culture in a manner that participants perceive as more subtle and safer than conventional protest, and which they believe will also yield more durable results. In contrast to the fixed-in-place revitalization movements documented by Wallace and his contemporaries, transition is unfolding across a global network. Its reach is facilitated by modern communications technology, especially online communication, in the form of websites, shared documents, social media posts, webinars, and online trainings. The Internet has thus become the transition movement's most populated and prominent gathering place. A global movement that promotes localization and in-place identity could be perceived as a paradox, but participants do not interpret it as such. Simultaneously rooted in distinct regional contexts and circulated along transnational grassroots channels, transition fluidly crosses political borders and spatial scales. In so doing, it connects participants to not one, but two kinds of community, fostering both local and global connections. On the one hand, transition responds to the disconcerting isolation, loneliness, and competitiveness critiqued by Robert Bellah and many others since, by engendering a rich sense of place and a strong local community. As Polk aptly observes, that such a movement has spread so quickly into so many communities suggests perhaps that the possibility of transition must be considered not only as a response to an environmental crisis, but as a project that might fulfill a deeper longing for connection to place, to a geographically bounded and carefully cultivated sense of home, and the opportunity to contribute to making it better. This thesis rings true in Central Ohio. A local participant declared, "We can't sustain this, so we can either have this complete breakdown into chaos, or we can create communities, so that when various structures fall out of place, we're not hunkered down in our little bunker trying to shoot our way out like the American mythology says. We are actually building a different world." On the other hand, transition gives participants a sense of connection to a global community, showing them that they are part of something larger than their own group, town, or region. Especially where climate change resilience action goes against the dominant cultural grain, extra local connections remind transitioners that they are not alone and encourage their continued efforts. As Bideau and colleagues discovered in their work among Italian transition participants, the feeling of being part of a local and global network was highly motivating and was closely linked to the shared belief that the group can change the situation through united efforts. When transitioners join local efforts to create a viable future, they do so aware that analogous action is underway elsewhere. Transition thus fulfills the critical social role of creating community, not only in the form of tangible connections among participants and between participants in the places they live, but also in the form of imagined connections to people they will never meet, but whose actions nevertheless inspire their confidence and perseverance. Exploring transition as revitalization reveals that involved individuals gain strategies for coping with anxiety, reasserting control over an uncertain future, resisting a problematic status quo, and developing more cohesive communities. More broadly, considering transition as revitalization suggests that environmental movements play important social roles that encourage participation, nurture continued engagement, and engender long-term environmentally beneficial action. As a Central Ohio transition participants once advised, working towards sustainability needs to be emotionally sustainable if people are to sustain their involvement in a way that allows meaningful change to occur. Environmental movement success, whether measured in terms of endurance or impact, must be understood as inextricably intertwined with their ability to meet interpersonal needs. Living in the Anthropocene means facing a future of climatic and ecological uncertainty, with the hope that we might mitigate, or at least find ways to cope with, the damage done by our predecessors, the only thing capable of assuaging our fear. At the same time, the way of life many of us were taught is no longer fulfilling. We now see the goals society expects us to strive for, whether money to match our neighbors, luxury pickup trucks, or social media likes, as both ungratifying and downright destructive. Transition dares participants to dream of a more sustainable, more resilient, and more satisfying world. In place of idle despair, it demands action. It encourages participants to understand their place in a larger system and gives them tools for taking practical action to change it. For those who feel unable to take to the streets, who lack faith in elected officials, or who have tried conventional protest to no avail, transition offers a way to resist a dominant culture of ecocidal overconsumption through simple, pragmatic, and intentional alternatives. It cultivates local communities and pride in place, all the while connecting participants to a global community of comrades who strive to embody the changes they wish to see in the world. Pushing past ingrained conceptual divisions to embrace environmental and social action as complementary and interconnected modes for environmental movement participation promises practical as well as theoretical benefits. A holistic understanding of why people participate or do not participate in environmental movements takes essential strides towards sustaining these movements and the positive environmental actions they promote. Thank you.